I probably wasn't sure what this game was when I first pledged it. At the time, I believe I thought it was a strategic game with some operational undertones, but now after playing it for a while, I'm pretty convinced it's an operational game that goes on forever with some strategic overtones. Aside from the obvious cues of scale, be that time or space, I think there are really two key ways in which the operational nature of the game is represented. One of them is pretty obvious and kind of familiar. It's supply. In the game, there are two mechanisms for generating supply. Supply cities, as indicated by that number there, as well as a headquarter. Those circular chits there that's a German, that's a Romanian headquarter. Those have ranges, and units within range are therefore in supply. Supply is, full supply basically means you're eating and fueled and enough ammunition to fight at full power. Out of supply, as indicated by these little orange or yellowish markers, indicates that you're eating, you have subsistence, but you don't have full complements of ammunition and fuel to fight at full strength. So your attack is limited. Your defense and your movement is at full capacity. Now on the attack, or even on the defense, as the lines move, you either outstrip or lose your supply network, your logistics network. That means you have to move it forward. There's two ways to do that. Capture a supply city. Capture it from the enemy, take it over, it'll now work for you. Also, you can move your headquarters forward to keep pace with your advancing army, and therefore pull up your logistical tail to the front of your attack or your defense. But those two things take time, literally, in game terms. So a typical sequence of events is that you'll have your units at full supply, within range of supply cities or headquarters, make an attack, make holes in the enemy line with your full strength, full power forces, and make large advances or enveloping attacks, whatever you do. Well, advancing takes you out of supply range. They then become unsupplied, eating, still alive, able to move. They can't attack, but with less power. So that means you need to move forward your supply network. But when you do that, it doesn't come immediately. You capture a city like this one, this is Kiev. As soon as you capture it, you drop one of these on it. This is a countdown marker. Countdown of 4. You move your headquarters forward. Maybe it was back here. You're going to move it all the way up to this city. Great, you've repositioned it, but again, you plop a countdown marker on it. And both these things have already got markers because I've already been playing. They've gone through a few cycles, but this indicates that supply city or headquarters is not fully functioning. It can't actually provide supply. You have to reduce the marker one step every turn that it has a railroad line of communication here, which means a headquarters takes 3 turns, that's 3 weeks, and a supply city takes 4 turns, 4 weeks, to become functional and therefore start providing attack or full supply to the units in its range. Now the sequence of play is really crucial for this. You check your unit's supply at the end of your turn, or really technically speaking, at the beginning of your opponent's turn, the very first thing you do. Then you reduce these countdown markers at the beginning of your turn. So that means when you finally reduce this to 0, becomes a full, capable headquarters, you actually don't get your forces back in supply until the next turn, the end of your current turn. So while it takes 3-4 turns to recover you actually have to wait another turn in order to have your forces at full combat power. So what does that represent? Pulling up your logistical trail, of course, but also kind of operational planning. You're going to try to get your units in position, stage headquarters at places where you're going to need them. You'll want to try to manage the entirety of your front, so maybe you're ready in the south and attacking while you're pulling up your tail in the north for another attack later, 3 or 4 turns in the future. So it's fairly simple concepts, supply ranges, and then the countdown effect of moving your logistical tail that gives you this ebb and flow, this surge of offensive capability, followed by some kind of downtime as you try to reestablish your logistics system. You're not necessarily just idle, because you can attack, it's just at a very low power. So you'll find yourself making these small oozing attacks. They're kind of referred to where you can move 1 hex in an enemy ZOC. So you'll just sort of shove someone forward 1 hex, try to get a little bit of an advantage, make a very low odds attack. Not a lot of them because you don't want to take huge attrition losses, but it's a way to keep the war going while you plan that next major operation. Another aspect of the operational nature is a little more subtle. It has to do with unit presentation. The Soviets, even though it's presented as a core level game, you're going to have most of your Soviet units built up into these 3-step armies or infantry armies here. Whereas the Germans will have large army built up, but also plenty of individual corps counters. There are stacking limits, of course, and an interesting aspect of the stacking limit is how much combat power you can get out of a hex. So I have 2 corps here, each have a combat factor of 6. They're allowed to stack together in that hex. They're facing a variety of Soviets here. Suppose if I got 5 and 1 defense factor there, so a total of 6. You might look at that and think, 2 6s against 1 6, that's going to be 12 against 6, 2 to 1. Nope, hold on. Stacking rules don't only apply to how many units you can put in a hex, but also how much combat power you can basically project from that hex. You can only have 1 major unit attack out of a hex. This is where it gets a little clumsy. A major unit is essentially a corps or larger. It's represented by the size of the counter. This is a medium counter, but it's a major unit. And this is a large counter, bigger, but it's also a major unit. So what it means is I can only attack with 6 combat factors out of that hex. I can actually also stack a minor unit, the small one, with them and potentially get 8 combat factors out of there. So I can have 1 major and 1 minor unit attacking out of a hex. But I can combine those 2 corps into the major large army unit. Once I've done that, I'm within the rules. I have 1 major unit. I can even stack a small minor unit on there. And now I can get 14 combat factors fighting out of that 1 hex. Whereas if I have them broken down into 2 counters, I can only get the 6. So how does that represent some kind of operational planning? Well, it has to do with the sequence of play. I can combine these 2 units into the large army, but I can only do that at a very specific point in the sequence of play. It's at the end of the turn, after combat, but before movement has begun, for the full movement phase. So that means if I have these 2 units here, in a given turn, I can't combine them in that turn. I have to move them so as to stack, wait for my next turn. My combat phase would actually be undertaken. Again, they're not combined, so therefore I'm not at my full combat power. So only at the end of that turn that I could actually combine them. So 1 turn to get together in a hex, next turn to combine them, 3rd turn now I actually have my full-power combat unit ready to go and undertake an attack. So that's kind of a way of representing some operational planning. The staff work is being done to bring those guys together, I guess is how I would think of it. Once they're there, now I can actually fight at my maximum capacity from one hex. So as often happens during an attack mode phase, you will open up a hole, you'll start to advance, you'll expand the line, you'll need to cover more territory. You can't always leave your units in these giant armies. Eventually you're going to have to break them down in order to hold your full line. So that means you'll break them down to hold a line, and then you'll spend that time pushing them back together at a critical point where you want to attack to create that army. And all that just takes time, several turns at least, to get them together and ready for your next offensive move. Now the Soviets have a similar consideration, it's just done a little differently. Instead of moving units around the stack, they have to build up their armies with resources, replacements essentially. You only build one level, one step per turn, so it can take you 2 to 3 turns to get a full-sized new army in place and ready to fight. So it's kind of the same effect, just done in a slightly different way. So the very fabric of the game includes these lulls. You'll have an offensive, a big attack. You maybe create an expanded line where you have to thin out your forces, take a lot of casualties. The Soviets will be trying to rebuild. The Germans will be trying to consolidate. Both sides will be trying to bring up their logistical lines to get their forces back in supply. So what do you do during those lulls? What is the gameplay like? Well, there are these low power attacks you can undertake, put some forces together. There's also this notion that they call oozing attacks, where you can move one hex around a flank maybe and try to cut off with zones of control the supply network to enemy forces, forcing them to either counterattack you to open them up or retreat a hex or two. So during those 3 to 4 turns, you'll be doing a lot of very low scale 1 and 2 hex kind of advances and maybe retreats. So not a lot of activity, but kind of representing that big surge and then consolidation and then maybe another big surge. Now if you can manage it yourself, can survive, that can also be a decent time for a counterattack. But again, even units out of supply, like all these Germans here, they can defend at full strength. So being out of supply is only a problem when you're cut off from your own lines, when you have no line of communication back to your rear area. That's when you become isolated and you take attrition losses and very severe movement and combat penalties. So what about the strategic overtones? Well, time and space, that's our first clue. It covers just about the entire war in this front, from 41 to early 1945. Just about the entire space, but you notice that it does end in Poland, Hungary over here, so there's no Berlin that you can capture. So the game actually ends in February 1945. If you want to capture Berlin, you'll have to wait for, volume 108, whatever release of the system that actually includes the final days. But basically you get the entire war, 4 full years, huge map space. One of the key aspects of the strategic presentation is the allocation and expenditure of resources. To a large extent, this economic map presents the economies and the production available to each side. For the Soviets, it's largely on map. For the Axis allies, it's off the map. So they're allocated resources each season according to their current situation. as the Axis invade, start to deprive the Soviets of some of their economic capabilities. They'll take those resources on themselves and gain them. Soviets will lose them. There's rules for relocating factories further east. And one of the key aspects of resources and the economy is also morale. For the Soviets, it's huge. They have to manage their morale against their war effort to make sure that the home front doesn't collapse. The Romanians and Hungarians also have similar concept of morale. But this map gives you a quick way to take stock of your economy, what you're owed every season, so that you can quickly assign those resource points to each side. A resource track helps you keep tabulation of your current resources. Every time you make expenditures, you decrease your number. Every turn, you're allowed to spend resources on building units from your force pool, replacing units in play, things like that. There's fuel, men, equipment, offensive capabilities, rail capacity, and that really important morale number. For the Soviets, if the morale falls to zero, it's an automatic loss. Morale is affected by casualties and resource expenditure. Essentially, if you're riding your home front too hard, that morale will start to plummet. So you can, try to manage that, and it's key that you try to manage that as a Soviet player as time goes on. Now, as a mechanic, this is fairly simple. Accumulating those points every season. Just record them here. Record your expenditures every turn. Takes a little bit of time to evaluate what you're capable of spending, because there is a speed limit, they call it. Maximum of 10% of what you have currently, in reserve, with at least 2, but no more than 10, you can spend every turn. So you kind of fiddle with that and figure out what your best use is between building forces out of the force pool or improving forces in play. Now, certainly for the Soviets, one of the key things about the strategic campaign game is the changing character of their forces over the years. They start out fairly weak with a lot of weak corps-sized units, but then those nice eight-powered three-step infantry armies, but over time they start to accumulate better forces, more air, more armor, bigger guard armies, larger guard and tank armies. And as the war progresses, you're able to start using your resources to build up those forces, improving your army and your capabilities. That's very much kind of a factor of the full campaign game, watching the growth of the Soviet army and preparing for it. You want to make sure you have resources available to make those steps when they become possible. And the last bit of strategic consideration, I think, really is represented by the cards. And there are plenty of cards that are specific to some kind of combat advantage. Tank aces, prepared crossings. Each side has cards like that. But many of them have to do with your resources and your forces, using them to advantage yourself in building and maintaining the resource pool. Just a great number of those. So you tend to use these in a more strategic way. Obviously you're trying to build your forces for the operational part of the game, but these tend to be used more judiciously on the back end at the higher level. Even though they're obviously used during the operational scenarios, you tend to use those more for attacking and defending in the scenarios. You want the quick results, whereas you take a longer view with these cards when you're playing a campaign. When I first saw this game, one of the things that really struck me as interesting was the wide variety of shapes and sizes and colors to the counter mix. Large to small, these, half circle, circles, just the different indicators for different parts of the game really struck me. I still like the way they look, but they kind of handle a little difficult in play, I've come to find. The physical components can be a little clumsy when making stacks. This is a good stack right here. We've got a large unit, or medium unit rather, an improved position, the out of supply, so kind of at a glance you can see what's going on there. Here we've got the large and the small stacked together. That's all fine, but it gets a little clumsy like in this case. Got this armored division stacked on top of a large infantry that is out of supply, where this guy is in supply. It's a bit of a clumsy, not quite stable stack. Similar here, we've got the countdown marker on the HQ. We have an out of supply marker, the improved position, and then the infantry unit underneath. So again, it makes for kind of a unstable stack. And when you're moving pieces around, trying to change combat settings, countdowns, things like that, it ends up being, case in point, you're a little clumsy. Now consider how this plays out when conducting a combat. You have, say we're going to have to attack with this Soviet army, this German hex. First I'd mark the Soviet attacker with an odds marker. Probably not 3 to 1, I'm just using a marker. Let's suppose that they have a shift, maybe coming from an attack capable headquarter. Well, I think I would use this little shift marker to indicate that so I don't forget it later after I've declared my attacks. Further, let's suppose that I want a attack to go in with an air support. So I would take my air units, strike unit with a strike marker, put that on the hex. He also has an escort. I think I indicated with the escort. I suppose the Germans are going to intercept that mission with their interceptor. That's not going to hold much longer. But they also want to counter-strike with their defensive attack. There's no way this stack will hold. They have to put their counter-strike. There it goes. Somehow I've got to make one stack out of all this stuff, indicating that he's attacking, and he has escort. I don't have the patience to make this all stack up. And finally, we're going to have the Soviets intercept the counter with their own interception. They could actually intercept the interceptor if they wanted to. That whole mess is supposed to be one stack and one hex for one combat. It's really hard to make that work. I have no doubt that works beautifully in Vassal. Everything looks great because everything is virtual. But here with these physical components, gets a little clumsy. This is an extreme example. Not going to have a whole lot of, defensive strikes, intercepting the interceptor all in one battle. That's, this must be the key moment of the war here. But it can happen, and just the nature of the beast makes it such that these things can make unwieldy stacks. The air system is also something you spend a huge amount of time on, whether it's during an offensive or during a lull. Keeping track of your air forces, keeping them ready, built, cycling back from missions, takes a lot of time. If I have any real beef with this game as a whole, it's the air system. I think it's just overcooked. I spend far too much time fiddling with these things, and the effect is really fairly negligible. I mean, it's not nothing, but in the end, I would not miss it if it were more abstracted. That's just me. Even though I love air systems in general, I like air games, in terms of the amount of time I spend, and this is a very time-consuming game, 1 week turns, covering the full 4 years, you're going to be here forever. I find myself wishing that I could kind of tone this down. Just do less with it and make it more abstract. this point, I'm slightly on the fence about this game overall. I admire some of the operational concepts and how they play out, especially at this scale. I'm okay with the strategic concepts. They're simple enough, and they address the overall campaign. But the time scale, the 1 week turns, and some of the mechanics that play out over those turns really seem daunting to me when I think about this system as a whole, as it'll cover the entire European theater with the release of the later volumes. Gameplay is just a little too slow, especially in that air system, to consider, playing a turn that encompasses everything from Scandinavia to North Africa, west to France and the UK. That just seemed really daunting. I'm not quite sure how that would play out. It would be such an enormous expenditure of time. I find myself kind of wishing this had been a little more slanted towards strategic and simplified a little bit of the operational. I have pure strategic games. I have pure operational games. This one, since it straddles the territory in between, does fill a niche for me. So in that respect, I do appreciate it. I'm just not sure in the end I'm going to be able to follow this series all the way through its conclusion. It might be too big for me to bite off.